All right, let's get right into it. If you're studying for the Canadian citizenship test, you know you need to memorize a lot of facts. But this explainer, we're going to go deeper. We're going to unlock the real meaning behind the symbols, the stories, and the values that actually define what it means to be Canadian.
So that's the big question, isn't it? What does it actually mean to be Canadian? The answer, as you probably guessed, isn't just one simple sentence. It's this complex, beautiful identity that's woven into the nation's symbols, its history, and even the words it uses to talk about itself.
So, think of this as our journey together. We're going to connect all those facts you need for the test to the bigger, much more fascinating story of Canadian identity. Let's get started.
Okay, so where do we begin? Well, let's start with the most visible part of Canadian identity, its symbols. How does Canada represent itself both to the world and to its own people? You know, it really all starts with a simple leaf.
The maple leaf. It's everywhere. Now, for your test, this is a big one. Block 370 tells us it's been a symbol on Canadian military uniforms since the 1850s. That's a key date to remember. But its story, it goes back so much further than that.
Just look at how its meaning has evolved over hundreds of years. It all started with Indigenous peoples who knew the maple tree was essential for its life-giving sap. Later, French Canadians adopted the leaf as a symbol for their own community. Then, by the World Wars, it was proudly worn on military badges, making it easy to spot a Canadian soldier. All of these different threads finally came together in 1965 when the maple leaf took center stage on Canada's new national flag.
Okay, this brings us to a really crucial point for the test. You have to be able to tell these two flags apart. On the left, you've got the Canadian red ensign. Block 273 points out this was Canada's flag for about 100 years. But on the right is the flag we all know today. Now, if you remember one thing from this section, remember this date, February 15th, 1965. That's the day the maple leaf flag was raised for the very first time. That's a high-value exam concept right there from Block 272.
So, you might be wondering, why the big change? Well, moving away from the red ensign wasn't just about a new look. It was a huge statement. By the 1960s, Canada was really coming into its own, and there was this strong desire for a uniquely Canadian symbol, one that didn't just point back to British or French heritage. The maple leaf was perfect. It was a unifying symbol for a country that was becoming more independent, officially bilingual, and increasingly diverse.
You can see this idea of layered history perfectly in Canada's coat of arms, which is detailed in Block 284. At first glance, it looks pretty complex, right? But it actually tells a story. It pulls in symbols from the founding European nations. You've got the Lions of England and Scotland, the Irish harp, and the French fleur-de-lis. But look closely at the bottom. It's all held together by a sprig of Canadian maple leaves. It's a powerful visual that says, yes, our history includes Europe, but it's all grounded in a distinctly Canadian identity.
All right, we've covered the visuals. Now let's talk about what Canada sounds like. Let's move from the symbols you see to the words and music that define the nation. What's the country's official motto, and what do its anthems really tell us?
You'll definitely need to know this for the exam. Canada's national motto from Block 96 is Amari usque ad mar. It's Latin, and it means from sea to sea. And here's a great piece of trivia from Block 341. It was suggested by Sir Leonard Tilley, one of the fathers of Confederation, who got the idea from a line in Psalm 72. It just perfectly captured Canada's massive geography, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Of course, today, many people say it should be from sea to sea to sea to include the Arctic Ocean, recognizing Canada's vast northern territory.
Now listen up, because this is a classic point of confusion on the exam. Canada actually has two official anthems. O Canada, from Block 138, is the national anthem. It represents the country itself, and it's what you hear at hockey games and civic events. But then there's God Save the King, from Block 139, which is the royal anthem. It represents the monarch. So why two? It's simple, really. It reflects Canada's dual identity as both an independent nation and a constitutional monarchy. Don't mix those two up.
Okay, next up, let's explore the symbols and traditions that speak to some of Canada's deepest values, things like sacrifice, service, and achievement. These ideas are really woven into the national consciousness.
Remembrance Day. When you think of this day, from Block 137, there are three numbers you just have to lock in your memory: 11, 11, and 11. It's on the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour. Why? Because that's the exact moment the First World War ended in 1918. It's a solemn moment when Canadians across the country pause to remember everyone who has served and sacrificed for the country.
And of course, the most powerful symbol of this remembrance is the poppy, which you'll find in Block 136. But where did it come from? Its story is incredibly moving. It comes directly from the famous poem In Flanders Fields, which was written by a Canadian military doctor, John McCrae, right in the middle of World War I. He saw these bright red poppies growing on the graves of fallen soldiers, and that powerful image became this enduring, worldwide symbol of their sacrifice.
All right, another do not confuse these two moment for your test. When we talk about honoring individuals, Canada has two highest honors, and they're for very different things. The Victoria Cross from Block 142 is the absolute highest military honor, awarded for extreme bravery in the face of the enemy. On the other hand, the Order of Canada from Block 276 is the highest civilian honor. It was actually created in 1967, and it recognizes an outstanding lifetime of contribution to Canada in any field: arts, science, community service. It really reflects a modern Canada that values all kinds of achievement.
You just can't talk about Canadian identity without talking about sports. I mean, come on, these aren't just games. They are a fundamental part of the country's cultural DNA.
For the test, there are two official sports you need to remember. Block 143 makes it clear: ice hockey is the national winter sport. No surprise there. But you also have to know the national summer sport from Block 144, which is lacrosse. And what's amazing about lacrosse is that it has deep, deep indigenous roots that go back long before Europeans ever arrived.
But let's be real, hockey is so much more than just a sport in Canada. It's a national story. Sure, trophies like the Stanley Cup, mentioned in Block 281, are legendary. But it's moments like the 1972 Summit Series, from Block 260, that show its true power. When Paul Henderson scored that winning goal against the Soviet Union, it wasn't just a sports victory, no way. It was this incredible, defining moment of national pride and unity, right in the middle of the Cold War.
Finally, let's get to the most important part of Canadian identity: the people themselves. Who are Canadians? What languages do they speak? And how has this country chosen to define itself through diversity?
Block 156 lays out the numbers for us: roughly 18 million Anglophones and 7 million Francophones. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The real key here, the why, that you need to understand, is that official bilingualism isn't just a statistic. It's a fundamental political compromise. It's a recognition of the two main European languages that were there at the country's founding.
Canada has always been a nation of immigrants. But as Block 157 shows, where those immigrants have come from has changed a lot. Before the 1970s, the vast majority of newcomers came from Europe, but since then, most have come from countries in Asia. This huge shift led Canada to adopt an official policy of multiculturalism. And this is a really important idea. It was a conscious choice to create a mosaic where people are encouraged to maintain their cultural heritage, rather than a melting pot where everyone is expected to become the same.
And that same diversity is reflected in Canada's religious landscape. Now, as Block 151 notes, the largest single religious group has historically been Catholic, but that's changing. Canada has moved from being a mostly Christian nation to a much more religiously diverse and secular society. The number of people practicing other faiths or no religion at all is growing, and everyone is protected by the fundamental freedom of religion. So after all that, how do we tie it all together? Here's a simple way to think about it, kind of like 4 connected layers. It all starts with the historical foundations: Indigenous, French, and British roots. That history led to major political compromises, like bilingualism. Those compromises then grew into national values that became official policies, like multiculturalism. And finally, you see all of this lived out in everyday Canadian culture, through things like hockey, Remembrance Day, and all the stories we share.
And that brings us to our final question, something for you to think about. We've explored the symbols and stories that have shaped Canada up to this point. But a country's identity is never finished. It's always evolving. So as Canada continues to change, it's worth asking, which of these symbols will last? And what new stories and new symbols will emerge to define the Canada of tomorrow?